When we gaze into the unfolding tragedies of human history, we often believe we are observing the consequences of politics, of economics, of the frailty of leaders, or the ignorance of the masses. Yet, if we look more closely, if we listen not only with the ears of reason but with the ears of the soul, we discover that behind every calamity stands a pattern that is far older than any empire, more enduring than any system, and more powerful than the sum of human intentions. It is the archetypal shadow rising from the collective unconscious, shaping wars, revolutions, persecutions, and massacres with the same inevitability that storms gather in the sky when the seasons demand it. This dark truth is difficult to confront because it strips us of the comforting illusion that tragedies are merely accidents of poor decision-making or random misfortunes. If tragedy is archetypal, then it emerges as an expression of the psyche itself. And the psyche, as I have often said, is reality. When entire nations erupt into madness, it is not because each citizen has independently lost reason, but because something in the depths of the collective soul has been activated. The ancient patterns, the primordial images that dwell beneath our consciousness, surge upward and demand expression. These forces are not bound by morality, nor by the fragile agreements of culture. They belong to a deeper layer of existence, and when they rise, they take possession of men and women alike. I remember vividly, during the First Great War, how individuals who had once seemed rational, even cultured, suddenly spoke with the voice of possession. The archetype of Mars, of the god of war, rose in their unconscious and seized their mouths. They no longer thought, they chanted, they no longer reasoned, they obeyed. That is, the dark-toothed tragedy is not so much created by individual evil as it is the collective surrender to an archetypal current that sweeps through a people. Let us imagine for a moment a dream. In this dream, you stand in a great hall filled with mirrors. Each mirror reflects not your individual face, but the face of humanity itself. Some mirrors show the noble visage of the sage, some the radiant smile of the child, others the tender face of the mother. But as you walk deeper, the mirrors begin to shift. You see faces twisted by envy, eyes burning with resentment, mouths curled into screams of hatred. You wish to turn away, but the mirrors surround you. Then, at the very end of the hall, there is a single enormous mirror, black as obsidian, and in it you do not see a face at all. You see only a shadow, vast, faceless, stretching across the world, and suddenly you know that this is the source of all the other reflections, that the tragedies of humanity are not born from nothing, but from the shadow that lives within the collective dream of mankind. This is no mere image or fantasy. This is how the unconscious reveals its truth. The archetypal shadow is not an invention of my mind. It is an experience every culture has intuited. In myths, it appears as the dragon that devours villages, as the monstrous giants who threaten the gods, as the devil who whispers destruction. In modern times, we encounter it not as myth, but as history, concentration camps, genocides, crusades that burn the innocent, systems that reduce men and women to numbers to be erased. We may believe ourselves modern, rational, enlightened, but the archetype has only changed its costume. It is the same shadow, and when the conditions are ripe, it re-emerges. Why is tragedy inevitable? Because humanity, both as individuals and as collectives, resists confronting the shadow within. We project it outward. We say, the evil is not in me, it is in them. It is the fault of the foreigners, the heretics, the poor, the rich, the rulers, the rebels. Always the shadow is displaced onto another, and the more violently we deny our own darkness, the more violently it takes form in the world. Thus, the very refusal to integrate the shadow produces tragedy. The scapegoat is sacrificed, the other is annihilated, and in so doing, humanity enacts the drama. It refuses to recognize in itself. The pattern is as old as Cain and Abel, a brother unable to tolerate the reflection of his own inadequacy, projects it upon the other and kills him. But Cain's story is not merely one murder. It is the template for millennia of murders. It is an archetype, and every time a nation, a tribe, people divides itself into the righteous and the condemned, the pattern repeats. Cain rises again, and tragedy is born anew. Consider, if you will, the dreams of ordinary people during times of crisis. Again and again I encountered images of floods, of fires, of cities collapsing, of crowds consumed by a force they could not resist. These were not prophecies in the literal sense. They were psychic revelations of the archetype pressing into consciousness. The dreamer, though powerless to alter the course of nations, sensed the rising tide of the collective shadow. The psyche speaks through symbols, and when tragedy approaches, the symbols darken. What is seen outwardly as war is first experienced inwardly as nightmare. And so I tell you, if you wish to understand the future of humanity, do not look first to parliaments or markets. Look to the dreams of the people, to the art they create, to the myths that surface in their popular imagination. For there, the unconscious begins to reveal the archetype that is stirring. A society obsessed with apocalyptic films, with tales of the undead, with images of collapse, is already experiencing the shadow at the psychic level. These are not merely entertainments, they are rituals of the unconscious preparing for manifestation. Yet there is no need for despair in this recognition. To see the pattern is already to break its spell. What is unconscious controls us. What is made conscious can be integrated. The reason I speak of these things in the language of myth, of dream, of archetype, is not to mystify, but to awaken. If you see tragedy only as history, you remain its victim. But if you perceive it as a psychic pattern, you may begin to wrestle with it. As Jacob wrestled with the angel in the night, you may begin to integrate what you would otherwise project. And though the shadow will never disappear, it belongs to the wholeness of the soul, you can prevent it from taking possession of the world. Still, the truth remains dark. For most will not do this work. Most will prefer to remain unconscious, to live in the shallow daylight of appearances until the storm breaks. And then, once again, humanity will ask, bewildered, how could this happen? Why did we not see it coming? They will not realize that the tragedy was not unforeseen. It was foreseen in the symbols, in the dreams, in the whispers of the unconscious. They refuse to hear. Thus, when we speak of human tragedy, we are speaking not only of suffering but of blindness. The blindness to our own depths is the first tragedy, and it gives birth to all others. When I speak of blindness, I do not mean only the blindness of the uneducated or the fanatic. I mean the blindness of the intellectual, the philosopher, even the spiritual teacher who believes he has transcended the shadows of the world. This blindness is subtler, more dangerous, for it is cloaked in the illusion of clarity. How many wise men in times of crisis declared with certainty that humanity had entered an age of reason, that tragedy was behind us, that enlightenment had conquered the primitive instincts. They forgot that the unconscious is not diminished by our proclamations. It is a living reality, and it cares nothing for our words. It waits, patient, until the moment of eruption. The unconscious is like a subterranean river. On the surface, a village may flourish, believing itself safe, building its houses with confidence, but beneath, the waters press against the earth, winding and swelling. For a time they remain hidden, but when the pressure becomes too great, the ground cracks and the flood bursts forth. So it is with the collective psyche. We build our civilizations, our laws, our philosophies, and we forget the river beneath. But then, without warning, it bursts upward through violence, through madness, through catastrophe, and the people cry out, "This is unnatural, how could this happen?" Not realizing it was inevitable, for the river was always there. You see, tragedy is the eruption of what has been repressed. Individually, when a man refuses to face his shadow, it grows in the unconscious until it overwhelms him, manifesting as neurosis, as obsession, as destructive compulsion. Collectively, when a people refuses to face its darkness, it grows in the depths until it overwhelms the entire society. That is why history repeats itself, not because we forget the facts, but because we forget the archetypes. Let us return for a moment to the realm of dream. Imagine a dream in which a city is built of light. Its streets gleam, its towers rise into the heavens, its citizens walk in peace. But on the edge of the city lies a vast cavern, and from within the cavern comes a low, endless murmur. The dreamer avoids it, for he prefers the beauty of the city. Yet, as the dream progresses, the murmur becomes a roar, and suddenly the cavern cracks open. From its depths pour forth creatures of darkness, serpents, wolves, faceless figures. They rush into the city, and the towers of light collapse into rubble. Such dreams are not fantasies. They are revelations of the psyche's truth that no city of light can endure if its builders refuse to integrate the cavern of shadow. In myth, this cavern is Hades, the underworld, the kingdom of the dead. Every hero must descend into it. Orpheus, seeking his beloved Heracles, conquering death. Christ, harrowing hell. Why? Because the archetype insists upon it. To achieve wholeness, to attain true light, one must enter darkness. A society that refuses this descent, that denies its shadow, becomes possessed by it. This is why the darkest tragedies often emerge not from primitive tribes, but from advanced civilizations. The more we repress, the more violently the repression returns. Take, for instance, the tragedy of the 20th century. Nations of culture, of philosophy, of science gave birth to machinery of annihilation more terrible than any barbarian horde. It was not ignorance that fueled the tragedy, it was a refusal to see the shadow within. The more proudly these nations proclaimed their enlightenment, the more blind they became to the forces seething beneath their culture. And when the shadow rose, it did so with the full power of modern technology at its disposal. That is why the tragedies of modernity are so vast, so industrial in their cruelty. They are the unconscious, armed with science. Do not think, however, that this belongs only to the past. The pattern has not vanished. Look around you, and you will see the same symbols surfacing again. Hatred disguised as virtue, fear disguised as righteousness, a hunger for scapegoats, a fascination with apocalypse. These are not political issues. They are psychic symptoms. They reveal that the collective shadow is stirring once more. What then can be done? The answer is not simple, for the unconscious cannot be eradicated. It cannot be controlled as one controls a machine. The unconscious must be acknowledged, dialogued with, integrated on the level of the individual. This means the work of self-reflection, of confronting one's own darkness without projection. On the level of the collective, it means cultivating cultures that can admit their sins, that can confess their violence, that can look at history not only as triumph but as tragedy. But I must warn you, the collective resists this work. Nations prefer myths of purity, of heroism, of righteousness. They prefer to forget their crimes, and so the archetype remains unintegrated, waiting for another eruption. If humanity is to avoid endless cycles of tragedy, it must learn to live myth consciously, to see that its wars and persecutions are not only political acts, but mythological dramas. Then, perhaps, we might begin to enact the myth differently. Imagine if Cain, upon feeling his envy of Abel, had said, "This envy is mine, not my brother's fault. I must wrestle with it within myself." Imagine if nations, upon feeling the rising hatred of the other, said, "This hatred is our shadow, not the fault of those we condemn. We must confront it within." How many tragedies would be averted if such consciousness were possible? Yet this requires humility. And humility is the rarest virtue of all, both for individuals and for societies. I recall a patient who dreamt of a great theater. Upon its stage, a play was being performed, a tragedy of betrayal and murder. The dreamer, seated in the audience, began to realize that the actors were not strangers but aspects of himself. The murderer was his anger, the victim, his innocence, the betrayer, his fear. Suddenly the theater collapsed, And the dreamer stood alone upon the rubble, recognizing that he was both actor and spectator. Such a dream is a revelation. We are not merely victims of tragedy, we are participants in it. The pattern unfolds through us, and until we recognize ourselves in the drama, it will continue to repeat. So I say to you, the dark truth behind human tragedy is not that we are cursed by fate, but that we refuse to see the gods within us. The archetypes live whether we acknowledge them or not. If we repress them, they rule us from the shadows. If we face them, we may begin to transform them. This is the meaning of individuation, not only for the individual, but for humanity as a whole. Yet the path is narrow. The descent into shadow is frightening. The unconscious is not tame. It is a wilderness. When you enter it, you encounter not only your wounds, but the collective wounds of the race. You feel in your soul the echo of ancient murders, ancient sacrifices, ancient cruelties. You realize that tragedy is not only outside of you, but within you. And many cannot bear this realization. They flee back into denial, into projection, into the comfortable myths of blame. But those who remain, who endure the gaze of the shadow, discover a paradoxical light, for within the darkness lies also the seed of transformation, whose tragedy, though terrible, is not meaningless. It is the pressure of the unconscious demanding wholeness. It is the soul's way of forcing humanity to see what it has refused to see. If we can endure its lesson, if we can bear to look into the mirror of catastrophe, we may yet discover the hidden pattern not only of destruction but of renewal. When I say that tragedy carries within it the seed of transformation, I do not wish to romanticize suffering. Suffering in itself is not redemptive, it is brutal. It tears the fabric of families and shatters the innocence of children. And yet, within the vast design of the psyche, suffering is never meaningless. It is the crucible in which the ego is stripped of its illusions, forced to encounter the deeper forces that shape life, just as a dream may terrify the dreamer, but also awaken him to truths he had denied. So too collective tragedy can reveal to humanity the patterns it has long refused to acknowledge. But we must be careful here, for there are two possible responses to tragedy. One is regression into unconsciousness. People may suffer, and instead of learning, it may harden its heart, intensify its projections, and seek revenge. This is the path of endless repetition, where tragedy begets tragedy. Each generation offering its children to the same archetypal cycle of hatred and destruction. The other response is integration, where the suffering becomes a mirror in which humanity sees its own face, its own shadow, and chooses to begin the arduous path of individuation. Think of an individual who suffers a great personal loss. He may grow bitter, blaming the world, cursing fate, retreating into cynicism, or he may, through deep reflection, recognize in his loss the fragility of life, the need to cultivate inner depth, the call to become more than he was before. The same is true of civilizations. After a tragedy, they may choose to double down on denial, or they may begin to awaken. The outcome depends on whether the unconscious is faced or avoided. Now, I must speak of a truth that often disturbs my listeners. The archetypes are not moral in the human sense. They are energies, forms, patterns of psychic life. The shadow is not evil in itself. It is the rejected, the repressed, the unlived. When it erupts into tragedy, it is not because it has chosen evil, but because humanity has failed to integrate it. In myth, the dragon is not evil. It is the guardian of treasure. But when unacknowledged, it devours. If confronted consciously, it yields transformation. Thus, the tragedies of history are not punishments from without, but consequences from within. Consider the myth of Oedipus. The tragedy unfolds not because Oedipus is a villain, but because he is unconscious of the forces moving within him. Fate, in this sense, is the unconscious itself. What is unknown directs us. And so long as we refuse to know ourselves, we remain bound to tragedy. The oracle does not curse Oedipus with blindness. Oedipus blinds himself when he sees the truth too late. This blindness is the metaphor of the ego that refuses self-knowledge until catastrophe has already struck. We must ask, then, is humanity willing to see before the tragedy unfolds? Or must we always see only afterward, when the ruins surround us? This is the central question of our time. The unconscious is pressing upon us more intensely than ever. The dreams of individuals are filled with fire, with collapse, with symbols of the end. The collective imagination is obsessed with dystopia, with apocalypse, with worlds destroyed by their own hubris. These are not merely artistic fashions. They are messages from the depth. They tell us the shadow is rising. Will you look, or will you turn away until the flood comes? I've often said that what we do not make conscious appears in our lives as fate. This is the essence of the dark truth. Tragedy is not random fate, it is unconscious fate. It is what happens when we refuse to acknowledge what is within us. Wars, persecutions, collapses are not accidents. They are the inevitable outcome of psychic denial. This is why I urge every seeker, every analyst, every ordinary soul, do not turn away from your dreams, your shadows, your fears. They are not enemies. They are warnings, guides, heralds of what is stirring in the depths. Let me give you another dream. One told to me by a woman in the years before war erupted across Europe. She dreamt she was walking through a marketplace. At first, everything seemed ordinary. Merchants selling wares, children playing, laughter echoing. But then she noticed that the people's faces were masks, and beneath the masks there was nothing but void. Suddenly, a great wind swept through the market, and the masks were torn away, revealing not human beings but skeletal figures, hollow-eyed, marching in unison. She woke in terror, not knowing what it meant. Yet, to me, it was clear the dream revealed the archetype of possession, the loss of individuality in the face of collective madness. The masks of normal life could not hold, and beneath was the skeleton army of the unconscious. Shortly after the war began, such dreams are not given to terrify us, but to awaken us. If the dreamer had integrated the message, she might have begun to recognize the dangers of conformity, the need to preserve individuality in times of mass possession. But because she could not, the dream remained only an omen. This is the risk we all face. The unconscious reveals, but if we do not interpret, the revelation becomes tragedy. And yet, there is hope. Even in the darkest patterns, for the same archetypes that produce tragedy also contain the potential for renewal. The underworld is not only the place of the dead, it is the womb of rebirth. The flood destroys, but it also cleanses, preparing the way for new life. The shadow that devours may also be the dragon, whose treasure transforms the hero. The challenge is whether we can endure the descent long enough to find the treasure, or whether we are consumed before we can claim it. This is why individuation is not a luxury of the few, but a necessity for humanity. Each person who confronts his or her shadow, who integrates rather than projects, contributes to the healing of the collective. One might think, what difference can one individual make against the tide of archetypal tragedy? Yet the psyche is not mechanical. It is alive, symbolic, interconnected. The work of a single soul resonates beyond itself. Just as one dream can reflect the state of a whole culture, so too one act of individuation can influence the collective unconscious. The pattern shifts, even if imperceptibly. Imagine if thousands, millions began this work. Imagine if humanity, instead of fleeing from its shadows, began to recognize them consciously. The tragedies would not disappear, for the archetypes will always move, but their force could be transfigured. Instead of war, conflict could become dialogue. Instead of persecution, confrontation with one's own prejudice. Instead of collapse, transformation. The archetypes would still play their role, but in a new form, one closer to wholeness. We must remember the psyche is not against us. It seeks wholeness. Even tragedy is a movement toward wholeness, however violent. When the shadow erupts, it is not because the psyche wishes to destroy us, but because it wishes us to see. The unconscious will not allow us to remain partial, one-sided, blind. It forces us toward totality. And if we resist, it drags us through tragedy until we learn. This is the paradox at the heart of human existence. We long for peace, yet we avoid the very work that would bring it. We long for light, yet we refuse to descend into darkness. And so the psyche, in its relentless pursuit of wholeness, gives us the lesson in the only language. We will hear the language of tragedy. We are left then with a profound responsibility. To live consciously is not merely a matter of personal happiness or private enlightenment. It is a matter of collective survival. Every soul that dares to confront its shadow participates in the healing of humanity. Every individual who faces the darkness within lessens the pressure of the collective unconscious. To do this work is to stand as a guardian at the threshold between light and darkness, refusing to allow the archetype to erupt blindly into the world. Do not misunderstand me. This does not mean you will prevent all suffering. The archetypes will always move. The shadow will always press forward. But you may alter its expression. You may transmute tragedy into revelation, destruction into transformation. You may prevent the flood from drowning everything, allowing it instead to cleanse only what must be cleansed. In this way, the dark truth need not paralyze you. It can empower you. For if tragedy is inevitable when we remain unconscious, then awakening is the only true defiance. Consider again the myths of descent. Orpheus loses his beloved because he looks back in doubt. Heracles' return bearing strength. Christ descends into hell and rises again, carrying the keys of death. Each descent into darkness offers a choice. Will you be destroyed, or will you return transformed? The same is true for humanity. We are perpetually descending into the underworld of our own shadow, sometimes through war, sometimes through disease, sometimes through collapse. But if we can bring back consciousness, if we can wrestle with the angel and survive, then even tragedy becomes part of our individuation. Let me tell you of another dream, one that came to a man after he had suffered the loss of his family in war. He dreamt he was standing in a wasteland, the earth blackened, the sky filled with ash. He wandered aimlessly, filled with despair, but then, in the distance, he saw a small flame flickering in the wind. He approached it and discovered that it burned upon an altar made of broken stones. He reached out, afraid it would extinguish, but the flame grew brighter, warming him. When he awoke, he knew that although his loss could never be undone, life itself was not extinguished. There remained a spark, a possibility of meaning. This dream is the essence of the psyche's wisdom. Even in the midst of devastation, the unconscious provides an image of hope, not sentimental hope, not the denial of suffering, but the hope born from the recognition that meaning is deeper than tragedy. The flame does not erase the wasteland, but it illuminates it. In this illumination, the soul finds the strength to endure, and when individuals find this strength, they help humanity endure as well. I have seen again and again how people who confront their shadow become healers in the world, not because they preach or instruct, but because they embody wholeness. Their very presence alters the atmosphere of the collective. They carry with them the memory of the underworld and the knowledge of the flame. Others feel it, though they cannot explain it. This is how consciousness spreads, not through force, but through resonance. And so I urge you, do not turn away from the dark truth. Look directly at it. See the archetype in the tragedy, the shadow in the disaster. Recognize that what befalls humanity outwardly is what stirs within you inwardly. When you encounter hatred in the world, ask, where does hatred live in me? When you see madness in society, ask what madness stirs in my soul. This is not to blame yourself for the world's suffering, but to recognize that the pattern is shared. Only when each person accepts their part of the shadow can the collective begin to heal. You may ask, is this not too great a burden to carry both my own shadow and the collective shadow? And I answer yes. It is a burden, but it is also a calling. The psyche never asks more of us than we can bear, though it often seems so. To carry the shadow consciously is to participate in the mystery of life itself. It is to become a vessel through which transformation may occur. This is the path of the wounded healer. the archetype that suffers not in vain but in service of wholeness. If you walk this path, you will not be spared pain, but you will be spared blindness. And blindness, as I have said, is the true tragedy. To suffer consciously is to suffer with meaning. To suffer unconsciously is to suffer in vain. Humanity has suffered in vain too many times. It is time to suffer consciously, to descend with open eyes, to rise with the flame of meaning in hand. Look around you. The signs of the shadows rising are everywhere. Division, rage, scapegoating, obsession with collapse. Do not be deceived into thinking these are merely political or cultural issues. They are psychic symptoms. The archetype is moving. You cannot stop it, but you can choose how you respond. You can choose whether to be possessed or to integrate, whether to repeat tragedy or to transform it. If enough individuals choose integration, the pattern itself will shift. Humanity will still know suffering, but it will not always be the blind, repetitive suffering of unconsciousness. It may become the creative suffering of transformation, the labor pains of a new birth. That is the possibility before us. That is why I speak with urgency, with passion, with the voice of the unconscious itself, for the time is always short when the shadow rises. Do not wait until the flood comes to build the ark. Do not wait until the fire spreads to recognize the flame within. Begin now, in your own soul. Attend to your dreams. Listen to your fears. Confront your projections. Integrate your shadow. This is the work, and there is no other. And if you feel alone in this work, remember, you are not alone. Humanity has always had those who bore the shadow consciously, who carried the burden for the many. The prophets, the mystics, the visionaries, the artists, the healers, they were often rejected, mocked, or martyred, for the collective resists consciousness. But their work endured, and it continues to call us. You stand in their company when you choose to face the dark truth. So let us end with an image, not of despair, but of wholeness. Imagine the world as a great mandala. Each tragedy, a dark circle, each act of consciousness, a light circle. The pattern shifts as each individual awakens. Slowly, painfully, the mandala takes form. It is not perfect, but it is whole, and in that wholeness, tragedy and meaning are not enemies but aspects of a greater mystery. This is the dark truth behind human tragedy, that it is born not from outside forces, but from the depths of the psyche, that it is archetypal, inevitable when we are blind, but transformable when we see. And this is the light truth that within every tragedy lies the possibility of awakening, the call to consciousness, the chance to turn fate into meaning. The choice is ours, and the time, as always, is now